Today I'm going to be finishing up my discussion on slavery in the Old South in the 1850s. When I left off in the last session, I was discussing the idea of slave codes, the various laws that southern states had passed to restrict the activities of slaves in order to prevent any kind of chance of rebellion. And this is one of those things that Southerners had long feared, was the possibility of large-scale uprisings, slave rebellions, or race wars that would result in widespread destruction. And their constant or ongoing fear of this sort of thing was what prompted the establishment of these codes in the first place. And it's also what led to these codes becoming more strict and more elaborate as time went on. We talked a little bit about some examples of those various laws that we see, all designed to restrict the activities of slaves and define their status. And of course, we talked about how it also applied to free blacks living in the South. That's very small sliver of black society that was free and living in the South is kind of an anomaly in our story. Today I'm going to focus or start out by discussing the idea of the slave myth. And this will go a long way in helping us to understand why so many Southerners supported the institution of slavery, even though they did not actually benefit directly from it. If you remember last session, I talked about those over 75% of white Southerners didn't own any slaves at all. They didn't benefit from slavery directly at all. Most all of the slaves were owned by a very small minority of wealthy white plantation owners. But so we posed the question last time: why then would so many people who don't benefit from slavery, why would they so be so supportive of the institution, even to the point where when the Civil War breaks out, these non-slave owners would take up the cause of defending the South against the Northern attempt to abolish slavery. So this slave myth is at the heart of this whole question here. Most people at the time, again, the ideas of racism that we would think of today were very commonplace then. When we think of ideas of racism today, it's kind of shocking. It's unusual. Okay, why would someone feel this way? Our society's kind of evolved to the point where we know for a fact that there are no measurable differences between races. So there's no reason for racism or discrimination. But in the 1850s, this was not the case. Most of society believed that there were some inherent inferiorities about non-white races, and this was just kind of an accepted belief of most people in the world, especially here in the United States, where slavery still existed. Even among the abolitionists, people who were trying desperately to eliminate the institution of slavery, even most of the abolitionists still believed to some extent that blacks were somehow inferior to whites. Very few people advocated the idea of racial equality. So when we think of this idea of the slave myth, we have to think of it in the context of its time. Today, something like this makes absolutely no sense. There is absolutely not one single scrap of evidence to support an idea like this slave myth. But in the 1850s, this was pretty much in line with how the general public believed or felt about racial inequality. One of the reasons why we see the slave myth being put forth so actively during the 1850s is that this is in part a Southern pushback against the abolitionist movement. For a long time, opponents of slavery put forth a a political or an economic argument. It wasn't until we see the abolitionist movement really beginning to take shape that we see a moral argument against slavery, condemning slavery as a sin. It's evil, it's wrong, it's a crime against humanity, and so forth. Well, once this moral argument against slavery begins to take root among the abolitionist movement, Southerners start trying to push back against this moral argument with ideas like this slave myth. And this is an attempt to rationalize slavery in terms of Christian values. And this is, again, this is an attempt to directly refute the moral argument the abolitionists are putting forth about slavery. A lot of the specific arguments that Southerners will make for this slave myth, they'll say slavery is it's a good thing. It's beneficial. It's beneficial to black people. Without white supervision and guidance, blacks would be unable to provide for themselves. They would be unable to survive. And again, this is based on their belief that black people are somehow inferior to white people, which we know, of course, today is completely absurd. But in the 1850s, people genuinely believed this. Southern whites would argue that if blacks were free, they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves. They don't know how to do anything. They can't function without supervision. They would starve. They would be homeless. They would live in chaos. And one of the reasons they argued that black people couldn't do anything, they were helpless, they were ignorant, they didn't know how to do anything. From the other side of this argument, Northerners would argue back, saying, well, the reason that they're ignorant and that they're unable to do anything is because you have prevented them from learning anything. The slave codes prevent them from reading and writing and doing anything other than what they're told to do at that moment. So it's no surprise that the black population in the South, they are ignorant and they don't know a lot of things because knowledge has been kept from them. It's not that they have any inherent lack of ability. It's just that they have been so oppressed and imprisoned that they have not had a chance to learn anything else. So a lot of this is a lot of these arguments are full of holes because there's no real logic to these arguments. They're just trying to rationalize this. They're looking for an excuse, and a rationalization is just that. When you're trying to rationalize something, you're trying to find an excuse to justify what you're doing. You want to do this one particular thing, and now you're trying to find some sort of rationalization for it. And that's what's taking place here. Southerners, they benefit from the institution of slavery. They want to keep it, so they're looking for ways to rationalize it. And this is one of the things that this argument about the slave myth. This is not just used to refute Northern opposition to slavery. This is also used to reinforce the value of slavery to the non-slave owning whites in the South. Those small or the poor white farmers, small family farms, people that don't own any slaves, they might be inclined to listen to an abolitionist argument. So it's important too, from the Southern perspective, that they reinforce this idea that even though you don't own slaves, it's important that we maintain the institution because we need to make sure that the black population is supervised and cared for, or they won't be able to take care of themselves. So a lot of the people, white Southerners who don't own slaves, they start buying into this slave myth. Even though they don't own slaves, they start believing that, okay, well, yeah, maybe slavery is a good thing because it helps maintain order and in the black population. So the slave myth is used for a couple of different reasons. It's used, one, to push back against Northern opposition to slavery. It's also used to reinforce support for the institution within the South among non-slave owning whites. So again, this is kind of a twofold effort here. But just like the title or the term implies, this slave myth, a myth is something that's not true, but people believe that it's true. Of course, this is the root word for mythology. Legends and folklore, things that people believe that are handed down from one generation to the next, that there's not really necessarily any truth to these beliefs, but they believe it anyway. So this slave myth, it is a myth. It's not based on any kind of fact or reality. It's just based on something that people believe. And it's important to note here too that these types of beliefs, that slavery is beneficial, that slavery is a good thing, slavery you brought Christianity to the black population in the South, all these arguments that slavery is beneficial. This is going to be a kind of a divisive issue among several churches in the United States. Keep in mind the big branches of Christianity in the United States, the Methodists and the Baptists, both actively preaching Christianity among black communities, especially in the South. Now, while a lot of ministers during this time had taken kind of an abolitionist tone to their sermons and their ministry, Southern churches, Southern ministers were not so inclined to speak out against slavery as a sin. So what ends up happening is that, especially among the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church, both of those churches are going to split in the 1840s as a result of disagreement over how to address the issue of slavery. Northern Baptists and Methodists, actively preached that slavery was a sin, that it was evil, it should be gotten rid of. Southern Baptists and Methodist ministers, were very hesitant to say these sort of things because they benefited from their patrons were the plantation owners. Their congregation members were plantation owners in some cases, or supporters of slavery. So they were reluctant to speak out against slavery. And this disparity of perspectives really led to the split in both of these churches. It happened to a lesser extent in some other churches, but the Baptists and Methodists were the two biggest churches to suffer this type of split. And this is all tied to this slave myth, this attempt to try and rationalize slavery through a lens of Christian values. And again, this just did not sit well with northern churches. So what's important to note about this slave myth, from our perspective in the modern world, something like this it defies the imagination. It's bizarre and just it's laughable that people could actually believe something like this. But we have to remember that the world of the 1850s was a different world than it is today. It's completely different. And the attitudes and beliefs and values of the 1850s were built on a foundation that had been reinforced for over 250 years. Remember, by the time we get to the 1850s, it's been over 250 years since the first slaves were brought to North America at Jamestown and those New Virginia and Maryland and South Carolina colonies. This is 250 years later. 250 years is a long time, and when you have generation after generation after generation reinforcing these racist notions of differences between white and black, or these assumed inferiority of one race as compared to another, this gets reinforced over 250 years. By the time we get to the 1850s, ideas like the slave myth are a foregone conclusion. It's automatically accepted, because if you approach anyone and any Southerner in the 1850s and ask them to speak about issues of race or the differences between white and black, or their ideas on slavery, they're not just coming up with this stuff on their own right now in that moment. They're speaking about ideas that have been taught to them since they were born, ideas that were taught to their parents since they were born. So every generation of their family, as far back as they can remember, grew up in a world immersed in this idea of racial disparity. So it, by the 1850s, it never occurs to anybody really that there is another way. This is just the way that things are, and it's not going to be undone by an abolitionist movement. A few passionate speeches and church sermons speaking out against the ills of slavery. The abolitionist movement is working against 250 years of ingrained thinking. It's not going to be made to go away with just a few speeches. Even if Congress passed a law, it doesn't change this ingrained ideology. And this is what is going to make it so difficult to eliminate this type of thinking from the Southern mindset, and even from the Northern mindset to some degree. Keep in mind that a lot of the abolitionists, even though they wanted to get rid of slavery, they still clinged to ideas of racist ideology, that blacks were somehow inferior to whites. And this is something that a lot of people believed all across the nation, not just in the South. And it's for this reason that it's going to take, even after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment is passed and slavery is legally abolished in the United States, that doesn't make this go away. You can't make 250 years of racism disappear with a single document. It's going to take a long time. Even after slavery was abolished, it was another 100 years before blacks in the South achieved any degree of equality or protection against the law, protection under the law. Not until the 1950s, when the civil rights movement begins to flourish once again, do we see any real progress being made. So, and even today, we still, as a society, we still wrestle with ideas about race, and it's the fact that we're still struggling with this today as a society. More than 150 years after the end of the Civil War, it says something about how difficult it is to change people's thinking that has been developed over centuries of reinforcement. It takes a long time. It took a long time to build up that idea. It's going to take a long time to tear it down too. It's just this is probably the main point I want to make about this slave myth. Is it's not something that they just came up with in the 1850s. This was something that had been built gradually and reinforced generation after generation after generation, and it is hard to undo that. Moving on from slavery, just speaking more general terms about North and South, North versus South here at the beginning of the 1850s. All semester long we've talked about some of the characteristics that define these two regions. The North, the commercial, industrial, urban North compared to the agrarian, rural South. And we talked about how those characters began to develop very early on in our story. And by the time we get to the 1850s, it's worth taking another look at how those disparities have played out in the past 250 years, not just the institution of slavery. So we've spoken numerous times over the past few weeks about economic, industrial, transportation, banking, so a lot of these various aspects of life in America that are very different between the North and the South. One thing we have not talked about is education. When we look at education during this time period, there's just as much of a disparity between North and South in the realm of education as there is in all these other areas that we've talked about all along. There are very few educational opportunities in the South beyond public school. You learn how to read and write in those elementary, grammar school years, and that's pretty much the extent of the education that's available to you in the South. If you want higher education, like say a college or university level education, there are very few choices available in the South. In fact, most wealthy Southerners who want their children to have higher education send their children up north to the various northern universities, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, those famous northern universities. By the time we get to the 1850s, however, and these divisions between North and South have become very contentious. A lot of Southerners are arguing against that sort of thing. Don't send your children up north to be educated because they're going to be corrupted. They're going to be corrupted by the abolitionist movement. And of course, we have an example of that. Remember a few weeks ago we talked about the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, both daughters of a wealthy South Carolina plantation owner. Sent to the north to be educated, and that's where they got involved with the abolitionist movement. So there's, case in point, a lot of Southerners are concerned about that type of thing happening. That their children, who will be the next generation of Southern leaders, are going to be corrupted by Northern ideas if they're educated in the North. So some are advocating creating more universities in the South, and a guy named Leonidas Polk. In 1857 helps to bring about the creation of the founding of the University of the South. This is in 1857, and this University of the South was designed to be a college, a university level education, but with distinct emphasis on Southern culture and Southern ideals, both political, economic, and cultural. In fact, if you were a student at the University of the South in the late 1850s, you could enroll in a course in slave catching. That was one of the courses offered at the University of the South. So this University of the South, not just intended to be local college education, it was also intended to help reinforce Southern values, and this is significant because we see that things like this, organizations like this, dedicated to reinforcing Southern values, are yet another attempt by Southerners to protect their way of life from what they see as a threat from the North. The abolitionist movement is seen by the South as the embodiment of Northern attempts to crush and destroy Southern way of life and Southern culture. So things like University of the South designed to help reinforce those ideas, especially in defense against the abolitionist movement. And there are other Southerners. Leonidas Polk is just one example. There are many other Southerners at this time who are starting to advocate for things like this. Not only this, but referring back to industry and transportation, some Southerners are starting to argue at this point that perhaps we ought to develop more industry and transportation here in the South, because if we ever do break away from the Union, we're going to need to provide for ourselves. And so a lot of Southerners are starting to argue this. Instead of maybe we should try and start developing more industry, just like the North is doing. That way we'll have a better chance of providing for ourselves if the time ever comes for us to separate. So these are some of the arguments, or some of the ways that the thinking is beginning to change here with regard to some of these differences that we've talked about all along. All right, 1850. We've talked a lot about 1850. A lot of big stuff going on. Compromise of 1850. The whole debate over California. At the same time, of course, this Fugitive Slave Act was part of that compromise of 1850. And we talked a little bit about all of those various aspects of that compromise. But the Fugitive Slave Act was the most controversial out of all of those provisions that Henry Clay had proposed and Stephen Douglas was able to get passed through Congress. The Fugitive Slave Act was the most controversial. No part of that compromise stirred up as much trouble as this Fugitive Slave Act. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this in detail now. We didn't go over it much during that whole compromise of 1850. It was kind of where the focus was on a different topics. But we now can take time to focus specifically on this one aspect of that compromise. And just to remind ourselves, this Fugitive Slave Act is a federal law designed to assist Southerners in retrieving runaway slaves. Not only does this help provide Southerners with a way to retrieve their runaway slaves, it also requires Northerners to cooperate with authorities. So as a Northerner, after this Fugitive Slave Act is passed, as a Northerner, you are required by federal law to assist the police or the authorities in capturing and returning these runaway slaves to their masters. This is why this law is so controversial, because by 1850 the abolitionist movement is in full bloom. People have dedicated their whole life's work now to bringing about the end of slavery, and they're going to do everything they can to facilitate that, including helping runaway slaves to escape. So once this Fugitive Slave Act is passed, basically it's telling the abolitionists that they have to completely give up this cause that they've dedicated their whole life to. So this is not going to go over well, especially since now you're required by federal law to cooperate, not just you resist helping the runaway slaves, but you have to actively participate in their recapture. So of course, among the abolitionists, this is going to be outrageous. This is going to be a disaster. But not just for the abolitionist perspective, but also for the free black communities in the North. This is going to be a nightmare. There in most northern cities, there's large free black communities. In fact, in most of these communities, it's not just runaway slaves, but several generations of their family have lived and been born into and lived free their whole lives. So a lot of these northern free black communities are made up of people who have always been free their entire. They've never been slaves. They were never a runaway slave. So they were born free. They should have nothing to fear from this Fugitive Slave Act. But just the opposite is true. Because with this Fugitive Slave Act, you're going to see a lot of corruption taking place, a lot of mistaken identity, a lot of corruption, a lot of dishonest businessmen will present themselves as slave catchers acting on behalf of a Southern slave owner, and they will come to northern cities and attempt to recapture runaway slaves, when in essence they are just kidnapping free blacks in the North and then selling them as slaves in the South. And this happens frequently, not all the time, not in every city, but it happens often enough to where it instills this sense of fear among the free black community. The fact that you were born free and that you've lived your whole life free, every generation of your family has been free in this community, will not keep you safe from being potentially sold as a slave under this Fugitive Slave Act. So one of the reasons is that under this Fugitive Slave Act, the only evidence required to recapture a runaway slave is basically a southerner, a plantation owner, a slave catcher, one of their agents. All they have to do is come and point to a black person and say, that guy is a runaway slave, and that is the only evidence that is needed to justify an arrest warrant and capturing taking that person into custody and returning them to the South. And of course, under this law as well, the accused, this random black person who was just identified as a runaway slave, they are not even allowed to defend themselves in court. They cannot. There's not going to be a trial. There's not going to be a hearing. No jury. No arguments presented. They're not even allowed to offer any kind of defense or argument to protect themselves. Basically the only evidence presented is the accusation of the Southerner, and that sets in motion an automatic sequence of events wherein this person is taken into custody and returned to the South as a slave. So you can see here how easily this can be corrupted into someone with no. They're not even a slave owner. They're just a slave trader. They come into a northern city and they just point at a black person. That person's a runaway slave. I'm here to take him back to the plantation. And the police are like, okay, they take him into custody, they hand him over, and that's it. That's the end of it. And so it's no surprise that the northern free black communities live in a constant state of fear because of this. Because they, at any point, any moment, some stranger could come up and point them out as a runaway slave, and they're helpless to defend against it. So we're going to see, despite the fact that this law, the federal law, and there are stiff punishments in place for those who defy the law, we're going to see a lot of resistance, a lot of pushback. A lot of Northerners are going to resist this law in a variety of ways. That of course, this whole, a lot of them will argue that the whole thing is unconstitutional. You've got free blacks living here in the North. They're not fugitives. They're not criminals. They were born free. Their families are born free. Yet they have no right to protection under this law. So there'll be a constitutional argument to this. There'll be a moral argument to it. A lot of people will resist just because, okay, I don't believe that law. I'm not obeying it. I have no intention of obeying that law. And there's a lot of different ways that Northerners will resist this. Some will try to resist within the confines of the law. It's okay, I don't agree with this law. I don't think it's right. I think it's immoral, but I don't want to go to jail for breaking the law, so they'll get creative. They'll find a way to resist this law without actually breaking it. One example is that sometimes northern communities would raise money to purchase the freedom of an accused runaway slave. An example in New York City, a man was seized and accused of being a runaway slave, and he was convicted, and he was going to be returned to slavery in Maryland without even being allowed any kind of trial or to communicate with his family or anything. What happened was the black community there in New York City, along with their white counterparts in the abolitionist movement, raised a large sum of money and purchased this guy's freedom, and were able to retrieve him. So they were resisting the law, but they were still operating within the law. They weren't actually breaking the law. Some will just openly defy the law. They'll take resistance to a defiant level. We'll see in Boston there was an incident where two slave catchers from Georgia tried to reclaim a couple of runaway slaves, a husband and wife, and of course these two they admitted that they were in fact runaway slaves. So according to the law, these guys from Georgia had a legal claim over this runaway slave husband and wife. What ended up happening was a group of abolitionists confronted these Georgia slave catchers, and they harassed them and persecuted them and just kind of drove them out of town. So basically the two slave catchers from Georgia were unable to complete their mission because they were physically driven out of town. The local abolitionists would not allow them access to these two runaway slaves. And of course, this was open defiance of the law. The law requires these people to assist the slave catchers, and here they were doing just the opposite. Later on, the abolitionists there in New York will help this husband and wife escape to England. So just kind of get them out of the country. That way they're a little bit more protected. They're out of reach. Another good example of open defiance is that, and this was in a play. This is also in New York. A runaway slave from Missouri had escaped to New York, and of course he was captured and arrested. And while he was being held in the local jail, awaiting his master to come retrieve him, a mob gathered outside the jail, and they literally smashed into the jail. They got the runaway slave out of jail, and they smuggled him out of the country up to Canada. So again, they took an active defiance of the law. The abolitionist mob just smashed into the jail and rescued the guy and whisked him away to Canada. So we see various ways that people are going to resist this Fugitive Slave Act. And one final example, and this is probably one of the probably the biggest example of government's organized resistance. The state of Wisconsin in 1855 nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. And remember, the idea of nullification, we talked about that. Well, it goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson with his Kentucky Resolution. Remember, South Carolina nullified the federal tariff. So here we see Wisconsin nullifying the Fugitive Slave Act. So this idea of nullification hasn't gone away yet. Some states are using this idea to resist this federal law. The state of Wisconsin, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court ruled that this federal law, we don't think that law is constitutional, so we're not going to obey it. The state of Wisconsin is not going to enforce this Fugitive Slave Act. So again, we've got a wide variety of ways that Northerners are going to resist this law, and again, in an attempt to try and protect the free black community from this ridiculous law. Looking at some examples here. Now, this is an anti-slavery publication. We talked about those anti-slavery newspapers, abolitionist newspapers, and so forth. This is one of those journals. It's just called the Anti-Slavery Almanac. Now, this was published in 1839, but it's a good example of the types of things that Northerners are doing to help protect the black community from this fugitive slave law. Here, the article is basically telling the story of a free black man who is kidnapped and sold as a slave into the South. So they're publishing this story as kind of a warning to the black community. Be aware of these types of things, because this guy was tricked. He thought these guys were his friends, and it turns out they were just kidnappers, and so on and so forth. So articles like this will be published and circulated among the black community as kind of a warning, just to be aware of these potential dangers. Here's another example. This is kind of a public service announcement in Boston in 1851. So again, this is soon after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. We see resistance happening almost immediately. Of course, this poster was put up by an abolitionist group as kind of an FYI warning to the black community. Advising them to be aware of strangers. Try to stay away from the police of Boston, because the Boston police are they're required by law to work with slave catchers in order to return runaway slaves to the South. So just kind of advising the black community to be on the lookout for this type of situations, to kind of watch their back. And of course, finally, it tells them to you basically sleep with one eye open, because you don't know who these people could appear at any moment, without warning. You have no way of knowing who they are. Be aware of strangers. So these posters would be put up all over the town, especially in neighborhoods that were predominantly black neighborhoods. Again, as just kind of a warning. Now, this type of poster is protected by the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. So this is another good example of how abolitionists are trying to work within the law without actually breaking the law. They are resisting. They're pushing back against this fugitive slave law without actually breaking it. Because putting up this poster is not against the law, but it goes a long way toward warning the black community of these potential dangers. All right, another way that we see resistance to the fugitive slave law, and actually this was one of the reasons, one of the factors that inspired the fugitive slave law, was the existence of this Underground Railroad. For years, even prior to the fugitive slave law, the Underground Railroad was this network of sympathizers and partisans, people who were willing to help slaves escape from the South into the North. It wasn't a real railroad. Underground, of course, is a metaphor here. It's all happening covertly, on the down low, in secret. It's no one advertise. No one has a sign outside their house saying, this is an anti-slave sympathizer. Runaway slaves, stop here for the night. That kind of. This is all covert. It's all hidden in the shadows. So it just hence the term Underground Railroad. And of course, they used the term railroad. Railroads were new, and then the novel industry at the time, so they just kind of copied a lot of the terminology from the railroad to apply to their network of escape routes and sympathizers. Of course, Harriet Tubman, one of the key figures in this Underground Railroad. Now, this has been going on for years prior to the Fugitive Slave Act. In fact, the Fugitive Slave Act was in part a response to Southern outcries over this Underground Railroad. All the slaves escaping, and of course the Southerners unable to do anything about it. This Fugitive Slave Act was intended to try and placate Southerners. Okay, yeah, we're going to try and undo the work of this Underground Railroad. Taking a look at our map here, it's important that we note here that there aren't any real specific routes here. There's no clearly identified paths or roadways. There's no signs along the road, and that's just the nature of an underground network. Is it's hidden from view. Only the people who know about it know where to look for it. If you're not part of it, then you'll never find it. So basically, what happens is that word is spread by word of mouth, in secret, whispers and rumors, and no actual names are disclosed. Basically, a slave who is planning on escaping, he asks around, he finds out where he might go to secure transportation or a free meal or a hiding place for the night or whatever, or some kind of assistance, and of course people who trust him share this information, and of course it's kind of it's all word of mouth. None of this is publicized. And of course, there'll be a series of farms and businesses and so forth that will assist these slaves in their escape toward the north or toward freedom. Of course, not all of them are headed north. And as we see here on the map, generally, if you were in the lower part of Texas here, it's a lot further to get north of the Ohio River than it is to get across the Rio Grande. Keep in mind, Mexico has outlawed slavery as well. So if you can get into Mexico, you'll be free. You won't be in America anymore, but in a situation like this, your main goal is to escape to freedom. But you can worry later on about where you live and where you settle down. Your main goal is to escape to freedom. So you're going to take the shortest route possible. We see too a lot of slaves out of Georgia and Florida escaping to places in the Caribbean. A lot of British colonies still in the Caribbean, and of course by this point the British Empire had outlawed slavery within its empire, so if you can escape to those British colonies in the Caribbean, you'll also be free. So while these are not intended to be specific routes here, these are just kind of general directions that runaway slaves are taking over this time period. We see that almost all of these routes end up in some kind of major city. And this is an important point to make here. If you are running away as a slave, you know that you're going to be a fugitive. You know that people are going to be looking for you. There's going to be reward for your capture. You're going to want to blend in and hide and make yourself as inconspicuous as possible. So if you know people are looking for you, you don't want to settle in rural Indiana or Ohio, because you're probably going to stand out there. If there's a black community there at all, it's probably very small, and a new arrival will be easily recognizable and noticeable. But if you go to Detroit or Chicago or Buffalo or Albany or one of these new northern cities, the large cities, there's going to be a larger free black community there. It's going to be easier for you to hide. There'll be more people there who can assist you and help you as far as settling in, finding a job, finding a place to live, people who would vouch for you. And again, in a larger neighborhood, a larger community, it's going to be more difficult to find you than it would be, say, in a small town in Indiana or Illinois. So the big cities are prime destinations for a lot of runaway slaves. And of course, too, notice a lot of these cities are on the Canadian border. And for many runaway slaves, that was their ultimate destination. Not just to get into the North, but to get to Canada. Because Canada, slavery had been abolished years and years ago. There is no fugitive slave law. Since it is a separate country, they are not required to, there's no extradition. A fugitive slave law in America requires that these northern states turn runaway slaves back to their southern states. Canada is not bound by that fugitive slave law, so they're not required to return anybody anywhere. So as a runaway slave, you're going to be a little bit safer in Canada than in a northern city. There's still a chance you could be recaptured in a northern city. But just kind of a long-term pattern here. Even after the Civil War, after slavery's been abolished, a lot of these routes, these destinations, will still be popular among Southern blacks as an opportunity for migration. Even after the Civil War, a lot of blacks stayed in the South after the Civil War, and for various reasons. A lot of them, they didn't have the means or the resources to make a long distance journey up north, so they kind of just had to stay where they are, just kind of accept their circumstances. But later on, maybe they saved up their money, or they finally had an opportunity, or got fed up with life in the South and wanted to move north. A lot of them would go to places where previous members of their family had gone. And we talked about the idea of chain migration. We talked about Puritans resettling from England into North America. The same sort of pattern will exist here. Slaves escaping out of Alabama and Mississippi, a lot of them headed to Chicago and Detroit, straight up the Mississippi River. Well, later on, later generations of those families, people who weren't able to escape in the during or prior to the Civil War, later on, after the Civil War, some of these families might decide they want to move north. Well, they're going to go to a place where they already know people. They're like, okay, yeah, I remember several years ago, Uncle Billy, he escaped as a slave, and he made his way up to Chicago. Well, we're getting ready to move to Chicago. Why don't we try and find Uncle Billy and see if he's still there? Maybe he can help us get settled in. So some of these migratory routes, or these patterns, will continue on after the Civil War, as we see blacks moving north in search of job opportunities or better living conditions, or to escape racial persecution in the years after the Civil War. So we see this Underground Railroad is not just something that happens once or twice. It's an ongoing activity. This network of people helping slaves escape. And of course, as a runaway slave, you're not totally on your own here. Your chances of escaping to freedom are going to be greatly increased by the fact that there are going to be people along the way who are willing to help you. In fact, this Underground Railroad, this network of escape routes, one of the reasons it's covert is because a lot of the people who are assisting these runaway slaves are themselves Southerners. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a couple days ago, or a couple sessions ago, about how not all white Southerners owned slaves. 75% of the South did not own slaves. Now, that doesn't mean that they're opposed to slavery. A lot of those people supported the institution of slavery, even though they didn't own slaves. But there are some Southerners who don't agree with the idea of slavery, for whatever reason, be it moral or religious or whatever, or maybe they just maybe it's an economic reason. They're a poor white farmer and they're struggling to feed their family, yet their neighbor who owns 100 slaves has no problem providing for himself because he's rich. He's got a whole bunch of people to do his work for him. So there's some sort of class resentment there. For whatever reason, there are some Southerners who do not support the institution of slavery and are willing to assist some of these runaway slaves escape. Now, for obvious reasons, these Southerners are not going to be very open about it. If you are a Southerner, if you're a farmer, a small farmer, you live in Alabama or Mississippi, you're not going to go around advertising that you're helping runaway slaves, because you're probably, at the very least, you're going to end up in jail. Worst case scenario, your neighbors will probably come try to lynch you or burn your house down. So if you are in fact helping slaves to escape, you're going to keep that a secret. Hence the term Underground Railroad. So these a lot of these Southerners that are helping, they'll provide a hiding place for the night. Okay, a group of slaves is trying to escape. Okay, you can hide out in my tool shed, or hide out in my barn, or I'll give you a meal, and then of course I'll smuggle you down to the docks where you can get a boat headed north or whatever. Of course, this is all advertised by word of mouth. At any rate, these Southern farmers who are helping these runaway slaves, they're not going to be open about it. It's all going to be kept secret. Only the people who need to know are going to know about it. So again, it's just one of the story of the Underground Railroad highlights the fact that this is not this issue of slavery and how it divided the nation is not a simple story. It's a complex story. There's many nuanced aspects to the story. Not all Southerners were supportive of slavery. Not all Northerners supported the abolitionist movement. So again, we've got variations on both sides of this issue here. It's important to remember that it's not a simple situation. Here, of course, is Harriet Tubman. She's probably one of the more famous people associated with the Underground Railroad. She herself, having been an escaped slave, wanting to help other slaves escape, she will be an active participant in this Underground Railroad. She'll make over the course of her life, she made many trips back and forth between the North and the South, assisting other slaves escape to freedom. She escaped. It's in 1849. She was about 27 years old at the time, so she was still a pretty young woman. This photograph, obviously, she's much older than that. It's probably taken some years after the Civil War. But she had an interesting career. She wasn't just willing to help other slaves escape. She became an active participant in the abolitionist movement. She worked for a while. She worked with John Brown, who we'll talk about later on in the next couple of sessions. She worked with John Brown and his resistance movement. Brown was probably an extreme example of a radical abolitionist. She worked with him for a little while. She joined the Union Army. She worked as a scout and a spy during the Civil War, and of course, after the Civil War was over, she became involved with the women's rights movement. And again, helped advocate for some of those women's rights issues, especially as they pertain to black women. Black women, in addition to white women, wanted these same rights. So again, she participated in that. So it's quite an active career. Pretty much everything she did was oriented toward helping people to achieve various forms of freedom. Our final piece here in terms of this issue of slavery and how it was dividing the nation during the early 1850s, and how the situation was playing out in the early 1850s. A novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be published in 1852. And this book is going to be a huge catalyst of controversy in terms of the abolitionist movement and bringing the issue of slavery to the public eye. To begin with, the novel itself, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is a work of fiction. There was no real person named Tom. All of this were characters created by Harriet Beecher Stowe in an attempt to tell the story of slavery and the hardships and the brutality that was endured by slaves in general. So while she's not trying to to produce a documentative account here. She's trying to present the story of slavery in a way that humanizes it. Up to this point, a lot of what is published about slavery is talking about it from the religious perspective or political perspective. It's a big issue, a big controversial issue in politics and society, and it's being debated in Congress and debated in public and speeches. But to a lot of people in America at the time, who don't have any kind of connection with the institution of slavery, it's hard for them to get their minds around it as a political idea or an economic idea or this big moral picture. This novel is an attempt to try and personalize this issue, to try to put a face on this issue, and the character of Tom provides a face for this institution of slavery. This institution is not just some kind of an abstract concept. It affects real people. Real people, actual people are suffering because of this institution. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is an attempt to tell the story of how actual people are suffering as a result of this. So while it is a work of fiction, it is based on stories that Stowe had heard from runaway slaves, former slaves, people who had traveled in the South and come back with these stories. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she had spoken with people like Frederick Douglass, people who had been slaves and had escaped, and so while she herself has never been to the South and she doesn't have any real direct first-hand knowledge of these issues, she has spoken with a lot of people who have experienced these things. And the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's kind of a composite of all of these stories. So she's taking little bits and pieces of all these stories about slavery and kind of put them together in a single narrative to make it a little bit easier to digest for the average reader. And of course, this is aimed at the average reader. This wasn't written on a level of on an academic level or a religious level or political level. It was written to be consumed by the average American citizen. Now, what's important about this is, again, even though it was a work of fiction, it's going to have a huge impact. By giving this institution of slavery a face, it presents it in a way that is relatable to everybody. The average person, it's difficult for them to relate to big political ideas or big economic ideas, but it's easy for them to relate to a character story, a story about a character, and that's why this story is so important, because it presents the issue of slavery in a relatable way, a way people can relate to. And why this is important is because a lot of people in America, in some northern states where slavery hadn't existed for several generations, a lot of people, say in Maine or upstate New York or Massachusetts, they've not had any contact with slavery for generations, and in fact, some people may not ever have even met a black person before. And it's these people that this story is aimed at, because one of the biggest enemies of the abolitionist movement is not Southern resistance, but it's Northern apathy. A lot of people in the North are inclined to take the position that, well, I don't know any slaves. I'm not a slave owner. I've never had any slaves. No member of my family has ever owned slaves. I don't even know any black people. Why should I care about this issue? Well, it's those people that Stowe is targeting with this story, because those people who are so indifferent, or it doesn't occur to them, or it's not something that's important to them in their life, doesn't affect their lives. Those are the people who need to hear this story. And as it turns out, those are the people who are most affected by Uncle Tom's Cabin. The abolitionists, they already hate slavery. They're already working against slavery. They read Uncle Tom's Cabin and they're like, okay, there's nothing here that I haven't heard before. But those people who are uninvolved with or detached from this issue, those people are going to be the ones that are most affected by this story. They read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they have this OMG moment where they're realizing for the first time the horrors of slavery. So I've read about slavery in the newspaper, but I just kind of dismissed it as some kind of political debate. I had no idea that this type of thing was going on down there. How do I get involved now? What can we do to stop this? So just to give you some numbers here in terms of how much of an impact this book had on Northern public opinion. In the first week after it was published, it sold over 10,000 copies, and of course this is impressive even by today's standards. But in 1852, this is unheard of for a book to sell that many copies in its first week. By the end of the first year, it had sold over 300,000 copies just within a year. And again, this is phenomenal even by today's standards. By the time we get to the Civil War, so basically after about 9 years of publication, it had sold over 3 million copies, not just in the United States, but it sold tens of thousands of copies in Europe. So this is not just an American, it's not just influencing public opinion here in the United States, in the northern states, it's influencing public opinion in Europe as well. It's an international phenomenon. Now, of course, the nations of Europe had already abolished slavery years prior to this. But so in their minds, slavery is dead, it's gone. But a lot of the people in Europe, in England, of course, our closest ally, a lot of those people they've forgotten that the institution of slavery is still alive and well here in the United States. And this book being circulated so widely in Europe, it brings fresh attention to this issue from foreign governments. And people in England and Europe are like, I had no idea the Americans are still practicing slavery. What's going on over there? So again, this is heavily influenced, not just in North America, but in other places in the world too. In the whole rest of the 19th, one last little statistic here for you. In the whole rest of the 19th century, and in the entire 19th century, from 1800 to 1900, only one other book outsold Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that was the Holy Bible. So in a 100-year time span, only one other book sold more copies than Uncle Tom's Cabin. That just kind of gives you an idea of how influential this book became in terms of shaping public opinion. And that's its goal. Even though this is a work of fiction, it still had a very real impact in terms of how it influenced public opinion. We see a spike in support for the abolitionist movement. A lot of people who were indifferent about the institution of slavery becoming actively involved in trying to get rid of it. This book is going to have a huge impact. To a lesser extent, another book. Of course, here's Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is, of course, later in life when this photograph was taken. To a lesser extent, another book is going to have an impact in the same way. Published a year later, in 1853, a book entitled 12 Years a Slave, or the story of Solomon Northup. Solomon Northup was himself an escaped slave. But this story basically tells his story is a little bit different. He was not born as a slave. He was captured. He was born free in New York, where he lived his whole life. He was captured by kidnappers who basically tricked him into a phony business deal and then kidnapped him and sold him as a slave in Louisiana. Of course, he was able to finally be rescued about 12 years later in 1853. So this story is basically the story of his experience as a slave, and it parallels a lot of it kind of reinforces a lot of what Stowe had written in her Uncle Tom's Cabin. So whereas some critics might say about Uncle Tom's Cabin, well, it's a work of fiction, how does she know? A year later, Solomon Northup's story kind of reinforces what Stowe had written in her book, and this is all his personal experience. He's like, okay, this actually happened to me. This is all real. It's not a work of fiction. So these two books had a big influence in terms of shaping Northern opinion over slavery. And of course, from the Southern perspective, both of these books are decried as lies and slander, and of course they start just pushing back against this. And the role that these books will play in our story is that it just creates a bigger divide between North and South. Now you've got more people in the North calling for the end of slavery, more people in the South pushing back against it, and this issue of slavery becomes more and more divisive now. And as a result of this, the impact of these books, especially Uncle Tom's Cabin, the abolitionist movement takes on the shape of a Christian crusade at this point. It's not just a political movement or a moral movement. It's a holy crusade at this point, and that's when we see in the coming years after this, we see a lot of radical action being taken, and we'll talk about John Brown in our next session. We get into Bleeding Kansas in that story. We'll see a kind of a radical turn in this abolitionist story. At any rate, that's all we needed to get covered for today. When we come back next time, we'll still be in the 1850s. We'll just be looking at some different aspects of some of those things that are pushing the nation further and further apart and further toward civil war.